First, let me thank Books and Books for having me here tonight, and Mihoko and Ottavio for the very generous introductions. I really appreciate it. Okay, so the book is, as you know, Ontology Made Easy. It's a book about ontology, but more deeply, as I think Ottavio has already suggested, it's a book about philosophy, about what philosophy can do, about what we can legitimately do in philosophy, and about its relationship to other kinds of intellectual work in the sciences, for example. That's sort of the background story that I'll try to bring out. All right, now what is ontology, right? Well, it's usually characterized as follows, that ontology is the study of existence. The ontologist asks questions like, what exists, or what really exists? Now, we're all familiar with existence questions in normal, non-philosophical life, right? We might ask questions like, are there planets, other planets that have life on them, right? Or that are pink, for that matter, right? Are there ivory-billed woodpeckers, right? There are big questions about whether those were extinct or not. Did King Arthur really exist? Was there really such a historical person? What fundamental particles really exist, right? And we all have some general notion of how to go about answering these questions. Obviously, we'll defer to the sciences on the details of how to figure out what kinds of quarks there are or something like that. We'll defer to the biologists to set up their cameras in the woods of Arkansas, right? But these kinds of questions don't seem like questions for philosophers, right? They seem like questions for historians, for physicists, for biologists, and so on. So what's really going on in this philosophical discipline of ontology? Well, you might try to characterize it this way. You might say, well, they're really concerned with philosophical existence questions. I have to come closer. Questions like, do numbers exist? Do properties exist? I should carry this with me, I'm told. Do tables exist? Do organisms exist? Do people exist? And what might be surprising to those of you who aren't here from philosophy is that there have been philosophers in the last 50 years or so, who've given answers on each side of each of these questions, who've denied the existence of numbers, properties, tables, organisms, even people. So what's going on in these kinds of debates, right? And other people will say, oh no, of course they do exist. And so the debate goes on, filling the journals of philosophy. Well, in part, what's going on here can be traced back to Quine. Now, I mean, some existence questions have long had a role in philosophy. Questions about the existence of free will, for example, or questions about the existence of God, right? But a lot of these questions about the existence of ordinary tables and chairs, people, and so on, they weren't really debated until the last few decades. And what's really brought this sort of great proliferation in debates about what exists can be traced most directly to the work of the American philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine, and that's him there, who was writing sort of in the middle of the 20th century, though throughout quite a lot of it. So he published this famous paper, right? This is sort of the paradigmatic source called On What There Is in 1953, where he laid out this view. He's like, okay, so here's the question. What is there? What exists? And he lays out a kind of method for answering this question. A method that takes what philosophers are doing as being analogous to and continuous with the work of the scientist. Right, I'll just read out this quote now, and then we'll talk a little more about it. It says, our acceptance of an ontology being a view about what exists, right, is, I think, similar in principle to our acceptance of a scientific theory, say a system of physics. We adopt, at least insofar as we are reasonable, the simplest conceptual scheme into which the disordered fragments of raw experience can be fitted and arranged. Our ontology is determined once we have fixed upon the overall conceptual scheme, which is to accommodate science in the broadest sense. All right, so we have this sort of general vision that formulating ontology is sort of a piece with science. There's a certain vision of philosophy that has grown out of this and of ontology. To some extent, it's not clear that the people who practice what becomes called as neo-Quinean metaphysics are true to the historical figure here. I'll leave that to the side, okay? But here's the sort of conception that has grown out of Quine's work, which has become so common and so much the driving force behind the way these ontological questions are asked and answered, that it's become known as mainstream metaphysics. Right? It goes something like this. Think of ontological questions as continuous with those of the natural sciences. You want to answer your ontological question, say what there is? Well, start out by finding your best theory. Right? How do you do that? Well, in the sciences, you do things like you look to empirical adequacy, simplicity, explanatory power, and so on, right? In metaphysics, the competing theories are usually empirically equivalent. So instead, the arguments are all based on throwing around these theoretic virtues. You trade off simplicity in terms of the concepts you use for simplicity in terms of the objects, or whatever. Then you express it in standard quantificational form. That is, you put it in basic first-order logic, and you figure out what things you have to be saying exist, or what things you're quantifying over to make your sentences true. I'll say more about that in a second. Then, you only have to say exist. You only have to be ontologically committed to those entities that we have to quantify over to make these best theories true. All right, an example will make this all a little bit less opaque, hopefully. Here's one from Quine. Suppose a sentence of the theory you accept says that some dogs are white. Right? This, Quine says, commits us to dogs. You got to be saying, in effect, there are some dogs, there are some things that are dogs, and they're white. But Quine says, look, you don't have to be committed to there being a property of whiteness. Right? Suppose you wanted to accept a sentence like, some dogs have the property of whiteness, right? Well, you can just paraphrase it and say some dogs are white. Then you're not saying there is a property of whiteness some dogs have. And all you got to do is accept that there are dogs and some of them are white, not that there is, as Quine would put it, I think misleadingly, in addition, a property of whiteness. Now, this has grown in the philosophical literature to a sort of fairly standard strategy, right? Where, in part in the interests of simplicity, because this is seen as a virtue of the theory, a lot of philosophers will try to do without certain kinds of entities that other people thought existed. And usually the argument form goes something like this. First, give reasons for being suspicious of entities of a certain kind, why they're worrying, why they lead to complications in our theory, maybe why they lead to internal contradictions or problems about how we could know them. Then, show how it is that whenever we think we're talking about those entities, properties or whatever, really we can paraphrase that talk. So we don't have to be quantifying over them anymore. Then we can be, as it said, eliminativists about these, deny their existence, and have a better theory. All right, so here's some examples, right? Take the question, do numbers exist, right? Some philosophers have worried about numbers, about the existence of numbers. Why? Many reasons are given. Obviously, they're not spatiotemporally located, so where are these things? Are they up in Plato's heaven? How could we possibly come to know about them if they're not causally connected to us in any way, and so on? Then show that we can do without them. And this is a picture of Hartree Field, who tried to show how, against Quine, Field tried to show how we can actually understand scientific theories in a way that doesn't require us to quantify over numbers, and then we're entitled to deny that there are any numbers. Do ordinary objects exist? Tables, chairs, things like that. Well, Peter van Imwagen raised suspicions of the notion, the idea that they exist, by saying, look, if we accept that there are these sort of composite objects, objects that are made up of other things, simpler things, right? Then we need a good principle to tell us when it is that some objects compose another object. There's no good principle, he argues at length, that will tell us that tables exist. So we better deny that there are tables, chairs, other artifacts. All that exists, says van Imwagen, is organisms and simples. Well, do organisms exist? Right? Oh, sorry, first, this is Trenton Merrick's over here, who has different kinds of arguments against ordinary objects. He says, look, if there were ordinary objects like baseballs, even trees, then they'd have to have causal powers that are distinctive to them, that aren't just exhausted by the causal powers of their parts. But anything you want to say the baseball does, it's better accounted for by talk of the atoms arranged baseball-wise. Right? His argument applies also to at least some organisms. Right? So Merrick wants to allow that people exist because he thinks we have this consciousness that enables us to have control over our lower down parts, have top-down effects. If other animals have that, maybe they exist too. But any that don't, like, let's say probably trees and snails lack this kind of consciousness, forget about it. No trees, no snails. All right, now after hearing these kinds of arguments, this is just a little selection, you might start to wonder if something's gone wrong that's led to all these kinds of debates and led to all these kinds of denials of what seem like really common sense positions. And of course there's artifacts. I'm holding one now. Of course there's people. Some people have even denied people. Of course there's organisms, right? There's lots in this room. The person who sort of raised the most well-known criticisms of these kinds of debates in the recent discussion is Eli Hirsch, who's a contemporary philosopher at Brandeis. And Hirsch's line was to say, look, these really look to me like verbal disputes, cases where people are just talking past each other, right? They must, if Van Inwagen says tables don't exist, and Lim Baker says tables do exist, they must just be using exists with a different meaning or something like that, but each be kind of like speaking a truth in their own language, right? Part of what I try to do in Ordinary Objects is to raise an entirely different challenge to these kinds of debates, right? So this has been seen as the challenge to me. And those philosophers who are engaged in these kinds of debates about existence, all their efforts at defending what they do have been focused on saying, no, they're not verbal disputes. No, we're not using there is with different meanings, right? So I'm raising a totally different challenge for them, which I'll come to in a minute, but you've probably got an inkling of where it's going. It's easy to see, though, even before we get into this, that there's certain hazards of following this kind of mainstream metaphysics methodology, certain dangers. I mean, you end up with positions that are often wildly in conflict with common sense, right? You end up with a kind of mysteriousness. How are we supposed to resolve these debates? It often looks like people on each side, they're just offering these competing theories where there's nothing empirical to decide between them, where you just trade one theoretic virtue for another, or one kind of very abstract satisfaction of some metaphysical principle for satisfaction of some other one. How are we supposed to even go about deciding them? They're presented as often as sort of discoveries about what really exists. Look, all the folk are stupid and they think that tables and chairs exist, but I've got the true insight. I've discovered that really these things don't exist, right? But on what grounds, right, is this insight supposed to be happening? It's not conceptual, it's not straightforwardly empirical. And finally, you get this kind of worrying, at least appearance, of a rivalry with science, right? Because as I started at the beginning, it looks like the natural way to answer these kinds of existence questions, at least a lot of them, is scientifically. But biologists certainly will tell us that there are organisms. They'll tell us that there's hundreds of kinds of organisms in every square yard of the rainforest, for example. So it seems like there's organisms, right? So what's the sort of ground philosophy has to stand on to question these kinds of things? The idea that this kind of conception of philosophy leads to a worrying sort of rivalry with science, in fact, a rivalry that it seems like philosophy is bound to lose, has been popularized really recently by Stephen Hawking. Some of you probably remember when this came out a couple of years ago. Hawking has this book with Leonid Mladenov, where he says the following: people have always asked a multitude of questions. How can we understand the world in which we find ourselves? How does the universe behave? What is the nature of reality? Where did all this come from? We could also add, what exists? Right? Traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. Right? So you see here raised in very stark terms this sort of threat of a rivalry with science. Okay, so my responses to these kinds of ontological arguments have sort of run in twofold over the course of the years I've been working on this. In my prior book, my middle book, the second one, 2007, that Ottavio mentioned, Ordinary Objects. What I did there is to look, as I said, these kinds of eliminativist arguments typically go in two stages. One is to raise worries, arguments against the existence of the things that say they lead us into various kinds of trouble. The second is the paraphrase strategy, to show that we don't have to even talk as if there are such things. Right? There I go through in detail a lot of the particular arguments against ordinary objects, like those of Trenton Merrickx and Peter Van Inwagen that I just mentioned, and try to show where they go wrong, how these suspicions can be answered. Again, as Ottavio mentioned, what I'm doing in Ontology Made Easy is really taking a further step back to look at the whole methodology. Right? And there, what I'm really concerned to do is to argue that the very methodology and the very way in which philosophers are engaged in these existence questions has gone wrong. And part of the aim I have there is to try to press for reviving a more down-to-earth view of what existence questions mean and how we can address them. And it's a view of existence questions that really leaves no distinctive role, in a sense, for philosophy, apart from a role in doing conceptual work, but not in making surprising discoveries about what really exists. And I'll try to talk more about that. And in part, what I'm doing is trying to revive a more down-to-earth view of the role of philosophy, of how we can acquire knowledge in philosophy, and of what philosophy can do that will preserve it as a worthwhile enterprise, while avoiding this kind of worrying rivalry with science and this pretense that we're engaged in discovering these super deep truths about the world through philosophical methods. All right, there's actually a forgotten alternative. And in the first chapter of my book, I go back and redo some history. Right? Mainstream metaphysics has become so dominant, there's been little focus on the earlier history of philosophy. About 100 years ago, philosophers were really worried about this question. What can philosophy do? Now that the sciences have peeled off, right? It was just a little over 100 years ago, psychology was kind of the last to peel away from philosophy, right? I mean, the work of Brentano and his students. And there was a really commonly held answer back then. Popular among philosophers as diverse as Ludwig Wittgenstein, Edmund Husserl, Gilbert Ryle, and that's A.J. Ayer, and also the members of the Vienna Circle, Carnap, we'll talk about in a minute. These philosophers, despite their differences, which are great, as anyone who's studied a lot of philosophers knows, they still agreed on one idea, that philosophy is fundamentally concerned with conceptual work, and the natural sciences mainly concerned with empirical work. Now, that doesn't mean there's never any conjunction between the two. It helps a lot if philosophers know some empirical science, right? And of course, scientists have to do some conceptual work too, as the biologists figure out what species concept to use in a given context or whatever. But still, there's a sort of fundamental difference between these kinds of work that leaves room for philosophy. Now, these philosophers would have conceived of conceptual work in different ways. Ryle put it as sort of trying to examine the logical geography of our concepts, how they hang together. Wittgenstein would have said the main role of philosophy is distinguishing sense from nonsense, and so on. But they're all on basically the same side of the page here. And you can really see what I'm doing in this book is trying to revive something like this earlier conception of what philosophy can do, but in modern terms. Okay, so Carnap, one of the members of the Vienna Circle who held a view along these lines, he addressed the problem of existence questions directly, and he had a lot critical to say about the way metaphysicians handle existence questions, even back then. He distinguished two kinds of existence questions. Internal questions he characterized as questions that are asked using a certain linguistic or conceptual framework. And he thought of these as answerable easily, in something like my sense. I'll come back and talk about that. External existence questions, he thought of what the philosophers think of themselves as trying to answer, but if you take them as factual, they're nonsense, they're pseudo-questions. Or you can take them as practical. I'll come back to both of those in a minute. Let me just say first a little bit about how my view fits in. Those serious metaphysicians that we began with were asking these questions of what exists and trying to figure out what's the best theory and how we can paraphrase it in such a way that doesn't require us to quantify over problematic entities. They make ontology hard, right? For them, ontology is a difficult matter of deep philosophical argumentation, discovering truths that might overthrow common sense. For me, following Carnap, ontology is easy, right? In a couple of senses, right? Two senses. One, I argue that any well-formed existence question, that's something that I think are just problematic for various reasons, can be answered straightforwardly by conceptual work and sometimes also empirical work. So you want to know if there's a table? Do tables exist? Oh, there's one now. Yep. Okay, tables exist, right? We're done. You want to know if numbers exist? Well, let me ask you an easier question. Are there any prime numbers between 1 and 10? Yes? Oh, then there's numbers, right? We're done. Secondly, the second sense in which I think ontology is easy is that I think that a lot of disputed existence questions, as disputed by the philosophers, can be answered by trivial arguments from obvious premises that are agreed on by everyone in a debate. I'll give some examples of those in a minute. I think I got a different slide for that. Oops. Okay, so this is again sort of a view following in the lines of Carnap. On Carnap's view, these empirical questions, internal questions, internal existence questions, those questions that are asked using a linguistic or conceptual framework are answerable by empirical or logical means. So if the question is, do ivory-billed woodpeckers exist? Go put your cameras in the woods of Arkansas and figure it out, right? If you want to know whether numbers exist, well, start with an easier question. Is there a prime number between 1 and 10? You could generalize from those. If ivory-billed woodpeckers exist, organisms exist. If a prime number between 1 and 10 exists, numbers exist, right? And then you've answered the question in the internal sense. Now, Carnap thought that can't really be the kind of question that philosophers are debating about. Because if they were, why would they keep debating? It's so easy, it's so obvious, right? So he thought they must be trying to answer what he called an external question, right? Which is supposed to be a question asked, as Carnap phrases it, before the adoption of a linguistic or conceptual framework. And as I read it, the problem with that is before you adopt a linguistic framework that enables you to speak of numbers, say, or woodpeckers, or whatever, right? Then how can you even sensibly ask the question, do numbers exist? It's like asking, do husadoos exist? How are you going to address that? We don't know what you mean. This word hasn't yet been given meaning, right? So Carnap thought that understood as factual questions, these are senseless. That the most we can do for them, the best we can do, is to understand them as pragmatic questions. Should we adopt this linguistic framework? Should we speak of numbers using noun terms and talk about the number 2 and say things of it like it's greater than 1 or whatever, it's even? Should we adopt a linguistic framework that involves us in material object terms? Or should we just speak in terms of experiences or whatever? Okay, so drawing on this Carnapian tradition, and also on some work of other philosophers on particular cases, there's some neo-Fregeans who do this for numbers, right? I also, as I mentioned a minute ago, try to show that ontology is easy in the sense that a lot of these questions can be answered by trivial arguments from uncontested premises, right? So, this is why I brought these, you may have been wondering. There we go. There are 2 cups on the table, not contested by anyone, right? Obvious truth. But it seems like you can just infer from that, well, you can say, if there are 2 cups on the table, then the number of cups on the table is 2. That just seems like a wordier way of putting the first point. It seems redundant, right? So then we can infer that the number of cups on the table is 2. The number of cups on the table is 2. There's a number, namely 2, right? Okay, we're done. You can do make similar arguments for the existence of properties, right? Take that square, start from an uncontested truth, the square is red, or you could, with Quine, say the dog is white, if you like. So you can say, then, if the square is red, then the square has the property of redness. Again, this just seems like a wordier way of making the same point, right? It seems redundant. But then we can infer that there's a property of redness possessed by the square, so they're properties. Tables and cats, you run the same kind of argument, right? So the eliminativist, the person who denies that there are tables or cats, will say, no, all I think's there is particles arranged table-wise. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means, in their parlance, that there are particles that are bonded and arranged in a certain shape, say that shape over there, in such a way that they can support books and mugs and bottles, that maybe they were put together by an artisan in the right context, intending to make something people can use for these purposes. Ask an ordinary speaker. So there's a case in which all these conditions are filled. They'll say, you mean there's a table? Right? Sounds like that's all it takes for there to be a table. So I think that you're entitled to infer that if there are particles arranged table-wise, there's a table. And so from something that the disputants don't contest, that there are particles arranged table-wise, we can make a trivial inference and say, there's a table. So there are ordinary objects. Of course, you can do the same for cats. Okay, so on this view then, something's wrong with ontological debates. So this is what gets called a deflationary position, right, about these kind of metaphysical debates. But what's wrong with these debates, on my view, isn't that the disputants are talking past each other, each in their own sort of language, right? Not like Hirsch's view. Instead, the questions, at least taken in what Carnap would have called the internal sense, are answerable so easily, it's not worth debating about them in this long, protracted way. We can settle them. Now, a lot of the book's taken up then with answering objections to this line, which obviously a lot of the serious metaphysicians aren't going to take this line down, and there's been a lot of questions raised about this kind of approach. I'll leave those to the side for tonight, so we don't go too long. But here's some nice things if you take the easy approach. There's some pragmatic benefits for you, right? One is we avoid unresolvable debates. We settled them. We can also avoid the mysterious methodology, right, or the obscure epistemology, if you like, of philosophy. We're no longer accepting that there are any of these existence questions that require distinctive philosophical methods. No, it just requires normal old conceptual competence and often empirical work, right? We get the right sort of common sense answers to our standard existence questions. Yes, there are people, organisms, tables. And we avoid the appearance of a rivalry with science here. But a big remaining worry that lingers, especially for a lot of philosophers, maybe less so for those who aren't so committed, right, is what room this leaves then for metaphysics. Right? So, Thomasson, they'll say to me, right, aren't you kind of putting yourself out of a job here? Right? If it's all that easy, then what's left for metaphysics, or maybe even more broadly, philosophy to do? Right? And what sense can you make of, there have been all these really interesting historical metaphysical debates, like I mentioned at the beginning, debates about free will and stuff like that. What sense can you make of these debates? Are you just saying they're all just stupid? Right? What sense can you make of the importance and depth that seems to adhere to at least classic philosophical debates, even if you think that some of the more recent ones have gone wrong? Well, I think there is work left to be done. And part of what I really want to do, as I mentioned at the beginning, is to provide a sort of different vision of what philosophy can do that's clearer, that's not so obscure, that doesn't look like it's a rival to science. Here's one thing philosophy can do, what you might call descriptive conceptual work. As I mentioned before, I'm kind of hearkening back to that view from about 100 years ago, that philosophical work is fundamentally conceptual. By descriptive conceptual work, I mean work in sort of trying to analyze or figure out how our concepts relate to each other, when they apply and when they don't apply, right? And it can be really hard. So think about work on relations among our concepts of freedom, responsibility, and morality. A lot of the classic work done in debates about free will, you can really see as sort of exploring these conceptual relationships, right? Or think about the relationship between concepts like art, intention, creation, beauty, audience. How are all these related, right? Rich work for aesthetics. It's been done over hundreds of years, right? And it's still done. You can also do descriptive conceptual work in trying to figure out the functions of our concepts. Like, why do we want to have noun terms for numbers in our language anyway? Why do we want to have ethical terms in our language? What do they do for us? What can we do with ethical terms that we couldn't do without them? Right? Why do we want to have race terms in our language? Why have those come into language, and should they stay? There's also issues, descriptive conceptual work to be done in figuring out how to apply our old concepts in new empirical settings, right? You see a lot of really interesting philosophical work done along these lines, right? Now we've got medical abilities that we didn't have 100 years ago, right? So what are we going to do with our old concept of person, right? Does it still apply to someone who's suffered brain death? Can you apply, but it's still kept alive indefinitely, right, artificially, right? What about if we had a case, we can do heart transplants, lung transplants. What if you could do a brain transplant? Which would be the same person? Which would be you in this case? Or would either of them even be, right? Even, should we count any non-human animals as persons? I believe India recently declared dolphins to be non-human animals, right? Sorry, non-human persons, thank you. Non-human persons. Similarly, moral agent, right? We know a lot more than we did 100 years ago about the cognitive abilities of animals, about their social lives together, about their behavior. Knowing what we know now, should we treat animals as moral agents? Right? It's stuff that my colleague Mark Rowlands works on. As capable of having moral rights, you might also ask if they're capable of having moral responsibilities, and so on, right? All really interesting philosophical work to be done. But I think that's not all we can do. I think we can also be engaged in what you might call normative conceptual work. That is, work engaged in figuring out what concepts we ought to have, or how our concepts ought to function. Or in cases where our concepts just don't draw the line yet in what counts as a person or as a moral agent, where should we draw the line? Or should we? Or should we draw it differently for different purposes, right? And this is sort of my version of what Carnap would have called work on external questions. So I think we can engage in this kind of normative conceptual work when we ask what concept of art we should adopt now to include not just old-style representational stuff, but if we also want to include really interesting recent conceptual work, or work that doesn't aim for beauty or representation or any of those traditional values. What concept of person or freedom should we adopt, and for what purpose? And again, I think you can see a lot of traditional philosophical work in this vein. So when you see people like Clive Bell say, art's not representation, art is significant form, you can see this not as a reported discovery, but as a proposal. Let's count art this way. And then it's going to bring into our canon not just representational work, but he was interested more in the post-impressionists, given his time on Cubists. Which concepts should we retain, and which should we omit? Right? Do we want to retain race concepts? What's their function been? if they really are just used in order to try to justify a sort of unjust differential treatment of people, should we get rid of them and maybe replace them with something else, some sort of social concept? So all of these are deep, interesting questions, and they're all questions that philosophers have grappled with, whether in explicitly normative conceptual terms or under the guise of saying they're doing ontology and discovering what a person really is or what works of art really are. And I think a lot of traditional philosophical work that has value can be reconceived under this kind of heading. Right? But if we do reconceive it in this way, then I think we make the criteria of choice much, much clearer. Right? We know what we're up to. We can figure out what the purposes are we're trying to serve and what's going to serve them best. And we also, again, totally avoid the appearance of a rivalry with the sciences, because this kind of normative conceptual work is even more clearly not taken on by the sciences. Right? Almost everybody agrees that the sciences are awesome, but they don't really answer normative questions of what we ought to do and how we ought to live. And what concepts we use in these contexts are crucial, because they really are what outline how we live, what kinds of end-of-life treatment we give, how we treat and consider animals, what we value as art, all these kinds of crucial issues, how we assign moral responsibility. So it leaves a really clear role then for philosophy, and a really important and worldly role. It's not a matter, a lot of people criticize conceptualist understandings of philosophy as just making philosophy into this sort of trivial or uninteresting parochial exercise of examining our concepts instead of we care about the world. This is a way of preserving the sense that philosophy is relevant to the world, right? But without the mysterious kind of epistemology. So by taking this kind of route then, what I want to suggest is that we can really better preserve the importance of metaphysics as well as making it clearer. Not by treating it as a quasi-science, as doing something like the sciences, only deeper and more fundamental in general by philosophical methods we can do in our armchair, but rather by bringing up front its role in clarifying and choosing our concepts. And these are issues, I think, that have real importance to how we live and what we value. And that's it. Absolutely, yeah. I think I back up first. Yeah.
It sounds like there's examples you give aesthetics or movement. So are you saying that philosophers should concentrate on leave physics and mathematics and stuff like that alone?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think in some ways there's a clearer role, but there is a challenge with physics, I think, that it's become so difficult and inaccessible that there's very few people who aren't physicists who would understand the goals and concepts and terminology of physics well enough to help much with this kind of normative conceptual work. But there are some, and there are philosophers, right, who will make this kind of recommendation about how we should conceptualize the kinds of results we get from quantum mechanics, say. It's a little clearer in things like biology, right? Biologists operate with, what is it, something help me here, 20-something different species concepts? Yeah? And there you really see in a lot of cases philosophers and biologists operating back and forth hand in hand and figuring out what species concepts we should use for a different purpose. But again, you can do that so much better if you ask the question, what species concept should be used for purposes of ecology or evolutionary biology, instead of saying, what's a species really? I'm going to discover it, right? So I do think there's room there too. In part, the kinds of examples just reflect where I come from, that I'm most on my feet with, because most of what I've done, my sort of first order work, has been interested in issues of ontology of arts, ontology of ordinary objects, things like that. And it's a little easier to make the sort of general case of the importance of philosophy to human life historically. It's a little easier to make that with these kinds of clearly human concepts like the ethical concepts and aesthetic concepts. But obviously, biology is important to human life. So species concepts are important to human life. What species concept we use will make a difference maybe as to whether the pine rocklands are saved, right? So this has also real important real-world consequences. So I do mean it to potentially apply across the board, though exactly what role philosophers versus scientists play may vary in different cases. And in some cases, the scientists are less clearly involved. Does that speak to your question?
Suppose I were to say, the truths of mathematics, are they invented or discovered? Now, is it the mathematicians who answer that kind of question, or philosophers, or it's a stupid question, or how does that?
I don't think it's a stupid question, and I think it's a question that probably has to be addressed by philosophers and mathematicians working together, or at least by philosophers who really know their math or mathematicians who really do well at philosophy. And part of what you'll want to look to in that kind of context is things like the practices of mathematicians. There's definitely this feeling of discovery that you can't just make it up and so on, right? That will have to be preserved somehow in any good account. So that's not a kind of question that I've sort of addressed here directly, but it is the kind of question that I think is best addressed by philosophers and mathematicians working together and by looking at our mathematical practices, not by, you're not going to make a discovery, purportedly by looking into Plato's heaven.
Plato, that's exactly what I was looking to bring up. I think Plato would argue that an idea cannot be created or destroyed. That's something I think that idea can only be discovered.
Yeah, Plato would, but the question is this the best view of our ideas of gods? I mean, think about the idea of the electoral college. Seems like that was created at some point in history. It doesn't seem like that was really an idea around with Plato, right? So at least some of our social and cultural ideas, there is a strong feeling that they are created, that they are cultural products, right? So from this book, take-home lesson is, I don't think it's up for grabs whether there are ideas, right? Are they created or destroyed? Well, for that, I think this is sort of the subject of the next book I'm working on, which is a view on necessity and possibility. So that's a question like, can ideas be created? Right? Or do they necessarily exist forever? Those kinds of questions, I also think, are answerable easily through conceptual means. What we have to do is figure out what the idea of an idea is, how we talk about these things, how we individuate them, when we'll say that this idea came into existence. Did some ideas ever go out of existence? That's a good question. But all of these too, so the overall strategy I want to drive for all of this is the idea that these kinds of questions can be answered by nothing more complicated than empirical and conceptual work together. Though sometimes empirical work can be hard, sometimes conceptual work is tricky. There may be different ways in which we speak of ideas in different contexts.
Very simplistic. This is not my field. Isn't a table an idea that was created? There were not always tables, and there is a possibility they could not exist at some point.
Yeah, so I'd phrase it just a little bit differently. I'd say the idea of a table was created when tables were created. Yeah, and you can easily imagine there probably were old cave society or something without tables. So that's another case easier than the Electoral College, where we want to say the idea of a table was created at a certain time, maybe about the same time that tables were created. I don't want to say a table is an idea, because you can't sit on an idea or put a cup of coffee on it. That doesn't work so good. But the idea of a table seems like a perfectly good example. Yeah, more down-to-earth example even than the Electoral College. Yeah, back.
Yeah, as I was listening to you, I was thinking about when I was reading John Paul's start, and he was talking about exactly what's the seed. So I was thinking about that.
Oh, yeah.
I've been
From nausea? Is that what you're remembering?
Yeah, I forget which work it was, but I've always been fascinated by existential, philosophy. But even if I understand, I understand it. I mean, the way you're presenting it, it makes it sound silly to say a table's not a table. But isn't there a point? And I guess tell me how far maybe you think this could be pushed reasonably. Isn't there a point in really speaking as a non-philosopher, but isn't there a point in really questioning the basis of everything that we think, or pushing as far as possible, and I guess your point is weighing when it's useful to do that and when it's not, when the benefits outweigh but maybe that's maybe that's the answer to the question, but I mean, I was thinking in so many areas of life, even if it's just advising studies in social and natural sciences, or what's different aspects of culture, socialization, what's biology, what's nurture. There's so many things so many assumptions that are just kind of arbitrary. So how far would you, that are agreed upon culturally, but anyway, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, this has been one of the real historical roles of philosophy in trying to push this kind of questioning. And I don't mean to be putting the limits on that. What I mean to be doing is reconceiving what we can be doing in philosophy in a way that's clearer. So when people question the existence of tables, say, I don't think that's a perspicuous way of putting what they're really up to. I think what they're really onto, and the sort of interesting material that people like Van Inwagen and Merrickx have brought, is that there are these kinds of tensions in our normal conceptual system, in our ways of thinking about tables, right? We think of them as things that have causal powers, but we think of them as made up of these little parts, and that the real causal story goes on down there, right? So I find a lot of the value of some of these arguments, I think it's not best put as saying really tables don't exist. I mean, that just, obviously they have ways of trying to mitigate this, but it just sounds like this kind of discovery point.
Isn't it a lot of this getting as far as getting back to the origins of language and the development of the human brain and how concepts are created about, because in a sense it's true. I mean, it's arbitrary to call it a table. We could easily just say it doesn't. I mean, the whole idea of what exists or not, that's a choice humans have made for that something does exist or not. But we could just, we could hypothetically say we don't exist. But it has to do with like language and culture and.
Yeah, okay, so here's my spin on that. In a sense, it's not up to us what exists, right? I can't just decide that there's going to exist a box of gold in my living room and go home and find it. I can't just decide that ghosts exist, because I think that would be really awesome, or aliens or something, right? No ghosts, aliens, I don't know, but not around these parts that I've seen, right, and so on. But what we can decide, I think, is what conceptual scheme to use. If we're going to talk in terms of things like tables and chairs and the like, or if we're just going to talk in terms of fundamental particles and their arrangements, if we're going to introduce noun terms for numbers, for properties, if we're going to talk about the property of redness and such, if we're going to use a generalized term like work of art or not, what are the boundaries going to be of person? And that's what I think is really open to choice. And that's, again, a point where I'm really following Carnap's tradition. I don't think there's no rules there. I think there's still pragmatic elements that come into play as to what conceptual scheme we ought to choose for a different purpose. Kind of like, think about the game of basketball. Think about NCAA basketball for a minute, right? It's got some rules. Given those rules, it's not up to us who won the Duke UNC game, right? We can also mess with those rules. There's a fact about what the rules are now, but it's not like that reflects some deep truth about NCAA basketball. If they decided to change back in, the 80s, the jump ball for the alternate possession rule, they didn't make a mistake of figuring out what the rules were. And you make those rules changes on pragmatic grounds. You're trying to maybe minimize player injuries or speed the game along or something like that, right? And they may be better or worse at that. So I think of our choice of conceptual systems as kind of analogous to our choice of rules for games. As at bottom pragmatic, not a matter that has to discover, but sort of correspond to some deep reality, but where there are grounds for these kinds of pragmatic choices. Brendan, I saw you a minute ago.
So I guess I want to push you a little bit on some of the stuff that you got to at the end about there being some normative work.
Yeah.
And what I'm wondering is whether there's anything else other than the normative work, because the other kind of work you described about describing how our concepts work and how they relate and stuff, in the time period that you're talking about, there wasn't just a lot of development in physics and a lot of development in biology, but also in linguistics and cognitive psychology. And so you might think that now the people who are in the best position to tell us these kinds of things about, how do our concepts work, how do they relate, we should look to linguists and psychologists to tell us this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then, so now if the philosopher is retreating from, so the physicists are better to do that than us, and now the biologists come along and tell us, no, we really are species and these kinds of things. And now the linguists and psychologists are telling us how the concepts work and stuff, so what's left? We have to do the normative stuff about how should our concepts relate, and which concepts should we use, and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, do you really think there's anything else than the normative work left to do, or should we just defer to the scientists in all these areas?
Yeah, in a sense, I completely agree with what you're saying. And this is sort of a place where I think my work has progressed over the last few years. And I have a paper, I think it's the one for the Friday workshop, where I actually mention this point. So, I mean, in a way, there's two different projects. One is making sense of historical philosophy. And they're to say that a lot of historical philosophy was engaged in this kind of descriptive analysis. It's cool, right? That's still fine. But there is this question. This is a question that Gilbert Ryle reports that his tutor Patton asked of him. Right? When he said, "Oh, look, all philosophical work is conceptual work or linguistic work," and his tutor said, Ryle, how do you distinguish philosophy from lexicography, right? So that's what to me is in part what's really exciting about the idea of normative conceptual work, is that it's something that's clearly left over even beyond what's at least can be done by linguists and cognitive psychologists. I mean, in some senses, I'm not sure if all these traditional philosophical issues have yet been tackled by them, but yeah, that's what I think is particularly interesting. And I have this, for anybody who's interested in a shorter version, I have this sort of short piece in the Philosopher's Magazine, sort of popular, basically suggesting that philosophical work is normative work. And this conception I gave you tonight is a way of bringing metaphysics under that fold. Ethics was already there, right? There's ways of conceiving of logic in that way, and so on. But yeah, point completely taken. I actually totally agree. Yeah. I think I heard Guido first.
Yeah. This might sound like a stupid question, but would a dolphin know a table?
Which dolphin?
That's a good way to duck it. I mean, then, if you don't want to talk about dolphins, somebody in a society where there are no tables encountering a table, do they know a table? And if they don't, does that create a problem for your kind of easy ontology? Do you need a more complex ontology to deal with it?
No, I don't think so. So that's a good question. Let me try to speak to that. So yeah, I think that, I mean, the reason I hedged on the dolphins, I went swimming with the dolphins on Saturday. And the dolphins that you can swim with, they're very like enculturated human stuff. They recognize the fish bucket and things like that. But I think that a normal free wild dolphin or a person from a very different culture that doesn't use tables, they probably don't have the concept of a table. Obviously, they see, their eyes are affected by them, but this is a place where I'm kind of Heideggerian. I think if part of what it is to have a concept of a table is not just to see something in this shape and size, but something that's to be used for these purposes, to put our coffee cups on, not to be stood on, etc. And it's been created for certain purposes and so on. And people who aren't part of, or creatures who aren't part of that cultural, don't have that kind of practical understanding, I think don't have the concept of a table. But all that means is that there can be things of kinds that we don't recognize as individuals, and maybe even as a collective, too. So I think of what conceptual scheme we choose as cultural relative and largely pragmatic, again, in response to real needs and so on. But I don't think that means that ontology is relative. I don't think different things exist for us than for them. And they've probably got kinds of artifacts we wouldn't recognize and see. They're there nonetheless, whether we see them or not. We're just lousy anthropologists if we don't know what they are. Atavia?
I have a question about the easy argument. Right? So, for example, the square is red. Then you say, look, that just means that there is a property of redness. The square has a property of redness. And someone may worry, right, that the move from the first premise to the second is not so uncontentious. But of course, Quine would say, no, it doesn't. Right? So when you describe the second premise in the way it is there, you're actually adding extra stuff, properties, which is not part of the original sentence. Right? So I wonder if the easy arguments are that easy. Right? Once cast in a philosophical context. Because I agree with you, in an ordinary way, you say, yeah, sure, okay, if you want to talk about property, we don't usually talk that way, but okay, I can follow along. But that would be a very, already in and of itself, a very deflationary understanding of properties, right, which is already a sort of philosophically contentious side of the debate.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is contentious. I mean, I try to make it seem easy, but this is why the book Ontology Made Easy ends up being that thick, you know? How easy can it be? So it is contentious. I mean, but what it's contentious in is in the context in which a sort of neo-Quinean approach to metaphysics has been dominant. It's in that context that you think that there's a real significant difference between saying the table is red and the table has the property of redness. Why do we think this? Because we think that what matters for ontological commitments is what entities we're quantifying over, right? So in order to make the easy arguments work, right, then part of what has to go on, as part of what I argue for, is the idea that, look, you want to know if properties exist? You want to even ask the question? You got to use the word property. What does the word property mean? And then it's attached to this kind of functional pluralist view for people like Hugh Price, right, that says, look, the role of property talk isn't to try to track some extra kind of object, like the role of table talk is. Instead, property talk, plausibly at least, we'll have to look at our linguist friends to be confident of this, right, is introduced into language by rules like this. If you're capable of saying that If you're entitled to say the table is red, you're entitled to say the table has the property of redness, right? If those are really the rules that govern property talk, that's all it takes for there to be a property. There's no further question. Is there really such a thing, such that we're entitled now to introduce the noun term, right? So, and this is another sort of respect in which it's Carnapian. It says, look, we can have rules for introducing new terminology like properties, right? That don't say, ooh, first you got to check and see if you're entitled to introduce this new noun term because it's an extra commitment. If so, then okay, go ahead and introduce the term. Instead, we have terms that are introduced for other purposes, maybe simplifying our discussion of similarities in the case of properties or things like that, right? Such that by the very rules that govern these terms, as long as you're using them, that's an unquestioned entitlement. And what's gone wrong is the Quinean thought that there really is some serious difference in our commitment for the second versus the first. So it's a long road to try to make the case, and it relies on things like conceptual truth that Quine would have dismissed. But that's roughly the route to get there.
And the easy argument becomes an internal argument.
They're all internal. So when I say ontology is easy, that's basically existence questions considered as internal. And sort of the next big project I'm working on is existence questions considered as external, which would involve this kind of normative conceptual work that I'm talking about, and that you'll hear David Plunkett talk about on Friday, and I'll talk about also in my workshop. Is that it? Okay, sorry.
So thank you, Amie.
Thanks so much for having me, and apologies because I didn't get to.
More questions, then we have the book for sale at the counter in the front room over there. Professor Thomasson is going to be signing over there at the table to the left of the screen. I want to thank our guest introducer, Professor Otavio Bueno, and please give another hand to Amie Thomasson. Thank you very much. Thank you.